Imagine having your leg amputated right now, without anesthesia, of course. Just a few burly men holding your arms and legs firmly, a leather gag stuffed in your mouth to stifle your screams. The doctor takes a saw, places it against the bone, and begins to cut. Such was the everyday reality of early 18th century surgery. Brutal, swift, and most often, fatal. This grim reality confronted Peter the Great. His new regular army, his pride and joy, was dwindling not so much from enemy bullets as from the consequences of injuries. Any scratch could turn into gangrene. A soldier after battle was more of a burden than a fighting unit. The Tsar, for whom the army was everything, understood. An empire could not be built this way. He needed more than just a place for the wounded to recover. He needed a factory to produce doctors, a real one, with an anatomical theater, a pharmacy, and students who would dissect cadavers to unravel the mysteries of the human body. This endeavor, utterly wild for its time, required a person of a particular mold, not just a physician, but a manager, architect, and teacher all in one. A foreigner, naturally, a daring adventurer willing to exchange comfortable Europe for harsh Muscovy. And such a man was found. His name was Nicolaas Bidloo, and he had no idea what he was getting himself into. He was entering a world where the very word doctor was almost an insult, where healers were bone setters, barbers, and whispering old women. The same person who shaved your beard might casually pull a tooth with rusty pliers or bleed out bad blood by cutting a vein with a dirty knife. Instruments, whatever God provided. Sterility? Don't be ridiculous. A soldier with a gunshot wound wasn't treated. He was mutilated, as people tried to extract the bullet with whatever came to hand. The outcome was almost always the same: blood poisoning. This was medicine based on superstition. The main cure for everything was bloodletting. Got a fever? Let's bleed you. Weakness? Let's bleed you some more. Until the patient gave up the ghost from the loss of that very blood. Wounds were covered with ash, cobwebs were applied, and incantations were whispered. Pus in a wound was considered a good sign, supposedly meaning the body is cleansing itself. No one understood that it was merely the beginning of the end, a slow decay while still alive. But the main enemy wasn't dirt or ignorance. The main enemy was fear, a panicked primal fear of the dead body. To dissect a corpse to understand how it was structured, what caused its death, that was a sure path to hell. To damn one's soul, to hinder resurrection. The human body was a mystery sealed with 7 seals, forbidden territory that could only be glimpsed after death, and even then, not by oneself. It was into such a world, where there were no hospitals, no anatomy, not even the notion that a person could and should be saved, that the foreigner traveled. A world where people weren't healed. They were simply helped to die faster. And into this world came Nicolaas Bidloo, a Dutchman, son of a famous anatomist, for whom the human body was not forbidden fruit. In his native Amsterdam, dissecting corpses was not a sin, but science, almost art. He grew up amidst flasks, scalpels, and preserved specimens. He could draw, design buildings, and speak several languages. A true Renaissance man, cast by fate into what felt like the early Middle Ages. Peter brought him not just as a physician. Bidloo became his personal doctor, a trusted confidant. He lived at court, treated the royal family, and engaged in long conversations with the Tsar. Initially, perhaps, all this Russian chaos seemed exotic to him, an amusing barbarism that he, an enlightened European, was called upon to correct. He surely listened to Peter's plans for a large hospital, nodded, and made sketches. A monumental task for an ambitious man. Then, all this general, abstract horror became his personal problem. One day, Peter fell ill. Not just a cold, he was genuinely sick, with fever and delirium. And Bidloo, the empire's chief physician, was left alone with the illness of the country's most important patient. He looked around for help, for assistance, instruments, medicines. And what did he see? The very same sorcerers with their incantations and barbers with rusty tongs. They suggested bleeding the Tsar of bad blood. They advised applying frog skin to his hot forehead. At that moment he understood everything. This was no game of civilization. This was no ambitious future project. This was a matter of life and death right now. His own, first and foremost. For if the Tsar died in his care, no one would bother with the reasons. The foreigner would be blamed. He realized, to treat even one person in this country, Even if it was the Tsar himself, he would first have to build an entire world from scratch. A world where a scalpel was more important than a spell, and knowledge stronger than fear. And he had to build it fast. And Peter gave him carte blanche. Not just money, power. The location chosen was beyond the Yauza River, on the outskirts, where suicides and non-believers were once buried. Cursed land, as the people whispered. Perfect for building a temple of science, defying all devils. And so it began. It wasn't just construction. It was a war. Every nail was pilfered, every bag of lime sold on the side. The workers, yesterday's peasants, looked at his Dutch blueprints as if they were witchcraft. They had never seen such buildings. Huge windows for light, wide corridors for air to circulate, not to stagnate and bring pestilence. A separate ward for infectious diseases. Unheard of. Bidloo spent his days and nights at this construction site. He shed his powdered wig, put on simple boots, and transformed into a foreman. He personally marked out the foundation, checked the masonry, and delved into every detail. He swore so loudly that men's hats flew off, in a mix of Dutch, German, and hastily learned Russian obscenities. He threatened contractors with the Tsar's cudgel, and this worked better than any money. He was obsessed. Because he understood. This hospital was his only chance to survive and change something. It was his fortress in the heart of hostile territory. And so, amidst the mud and scaffolding, it rose. The first Moscow hospital. Not just a shed for the dying, but an entire complex. With a pharmacy where real medicines, not dried mice, were ground. With a botanical garden for growing medicinal herbs. And at the heart of it all, the anatomical theater. The building was ready. But walls alone don't make a hospital. People were needed. Students. And where to find them? Nobles disdained it. Merchants considered it sacrilege. And so, by the Tsar's decree, the first 50 students were rounded up and sent to the hospital. Illiterate priests' sons, soldiers' children, orphans, those who had nothing to lose. Bidloo lined them up in the cold, echoing hall. They shivered, looking around nervously. In the middle of the room, on a table under a sheet, lay something elongated. They guessed what it was. To them, it was a corpse, a desecrated body, a ticket to the underworld. To Bidloo, it was the key to everything. He calmly pulled back the sheet. On the table lay the body of a vagrant who had died the day before. A gasp of horror rippled through the students. Someone paled, and the Dutchman took up a scalpel. Steel glinted. He looked at the faces twisted with fear, and with one precise, deliberate movement, he made the first incision on the dead man's chest. In the damp hall, smelling of formalin and death, Russian medicine was born, not from a royal decree, but from that simple cut. And he began to show them, not to lecture in Latin, not to sprinkle abstruse terms. He simply showed them. Look, these are the lungs. This is how they look when a person has smoked tobacco. And this is the heart. See this little hole? This is what he died from. No mysticism. No divine providence or diabolical instigation, just a malfunction. This was his main secret, his superpower, if you will. It was ridiculously simple. Bidloo taught them not how to heal. He taught them how to doubt everything they had been told before, to doubt what the whispering old woman told you, to doubt what was written in an ancient book if you saw the opposite with your own eyes, and to believe only one thing, what you could touch. He explained it plainly. The human body is not a vessel for the soul, cursed or blessed. It is a mechanism, a complex clock. If a clock stops, you don't sprinkle it with holy water, do you? You open the casing and look. Which gear is broken? Which spring snapped? This is what he taught. To open the casing, to look, to find the malfunction. A bullet in the leg is not divine punishment. It's just a piece of lead stuck in the mechanism, preventing it from working. Pus in a wound is not body cleansing, but a sign that dirt has gotten inside, and the gears are rusting. Fever is not a demon possessing a person, but a signal that the machine has overheated trying to overcome a fault. It's all simple, logical, and terrifying, because it overturned everything they believed. His genius wasn't that he knew the answers. It was that he taught his students to ask the right questions. Not, what incantation should I recite, but what exactly is broken? And not to be afraid to seek those answers with their own hands, even if it meant looking death in the ribs. But this question, what broke? was deeply unwelcome to those accustomed to profiting from answers of a completely different kind. While Bidloo and his students were dissecting corpses, knives were already being sharpened for them. And these were not scalpels. These were far sharper knives, intrigue and denunciations. He was not the only doctor in Moscow, after all. There was the Apothecary Prikaz, an entire department of important gentlemen in powdered wigs. They too were considered physicians. They treated the nobility, prescribed expensive imported powders, and received vast sums for it. Their medicine was clean, cabinetnia, desk-based. They read Galen and Avicenna in Latin. They had never in their lives soiled their hands dissecting the body of some vagrant. And then this upstart Dutchman appears, claiming that all their scholarly books are lies. That truth is not in texts, but in dirty, foul-smelling entrails. He devalued everything their careers and income were built upon, and they struck. Not in open debate, no. They began to spin a web. Complaints flew to the Tsar's chambers. They alleged that the foreigner Bidloo was no physician, but a murderer. His hospital was not a temple of science, but a hotbed of heresy, where Christian bodies were desecrated. His students were not future doctors, but a gang of grave robbers. And most importantly, he was squandering state funds without account, probably stealing. Officials immediately joined in. For them, Bidloo's hospital was simply a huge expense they didn't control, a river of gold flowing past their pockets, and they began to block this river. Invoices for medicine suddenly disappeared. Bandages vanished en route. Firewood for heating the wards was forgotten to be delivered in winter. Every small detail, every purchase became a battle for Bidloo against an invisible wall of bureaucracy. He was swamped with paperwork, demanded to account for every nail, every leech. He found himself under siege. Every day he fought a war on two fronts. Within the hospital walls he battled typhus, gangrene, and the ignorance of his own students. And outside the walls, the envy of colleagues, the greed of officials, the quiet sabotage of a system that wanted to devour him. He could show a student how the heart worked, but he couldn't explain to the treasurer why he needed so much alcohol for preparations. He could save a soldier from blood poisoning, but he was powerless against the poison whispered into the Tsar's ears. He built a fortress to fight the plague, but it turned out the main enemy was already battering down the gates. And it wasn't death. It was his own, living, and very influential people. And Bidloo did what no one expected of him. He didn't write counter-complaints. He didn't go bowing to dignitaries, begging for protection. He locked himself in his hospital and began to work with double, with triple fury. He understood a simple thing. His enemies fought with words, and words are wind. They can be twisted, distorted, forgotten. As long as he was alive and nearby, his students believed him. But if he were removed, what would remain of his work? Dusty flasks and the bad reputation of a Dutch heretic. He needed an anchor, something tangible that could not be disputed, something that would teach for him when he was no longer there. And he found a solution. If your main enemy is lies printed on paper, then your main weapon must also be made of paper. Only this paper had to be imbued not with poison, but with knowledge. He decided to write a book, the first textbook on surgery in Russia, and he began to write. Not at night in the quiet of his study, but in snatched moments between operations and dissections. His hands still smelled of carbolic acid, but he was already taking up his pen. He described not what he read from the ancient Greeks, but what he himself had done 5 minutes ago. How to properly hold a saw during amputation, how to extract a bone fragment, how to apply a splint. Simply, clearly, without pedantry, like an instruction manual for a complex mechanism. But the main thing was not in the words. The main thing was in the pictures. Bidloo was also a brilliant artist, and he began to sketch everything he saw in his anatomical theater. Every muscle, every bone, every vein. He drew the instruments he worked with. He drew wounds before and after treatment. This was the first medical atlas in Russia, drawn by hand directly from the corpses his enemies called desecrated. He turned their accusations into illustrations. And so the day came when the scales had to tip. Everyone gathered in the Tsar's chambers, both his enemies from the Apothecary Prikaz with piles of denunciations, and the treasurers with reports of embezzlement. But Bidloo brought only one thing with him, his book, a thick handwritten volume in a leather binding named simply and clearly, Instruction for Those Studying Surgery in the Anatomical Theater. Peter, a man of action, a mechanic at heart, took the book in his hands. He didn't pore over the Latin. He looked at the pictures. He saw what he himself had seen when Bidloo showed him curious specimens in the Kunstkamera. He saw not sacrilege. He saw an instruction manual. An instruction manual for repairing the most complex mechanism, a human being. A detailed blueprint, understandable to an engineer, not a theologian. He turned page after page, and recognition and delight appeared on his face. Then he looked up at the hushed dignitaries, at all those people who had complained about the Dutchman, his methods, his expenses, and the Tsar silently pointed to the book, and he uttered one phrase that became both Bidloo's safe conduct and his highest reward. Teach by this. That was it. The dispute was over. The enemies had brought the Tsar poison on paper, but Bidloo had brought medicine. He won their own game. He fought bureaucracy not with complaints, but with an undeniable fact. A massive, beautifully illustrated book where the same thing was written on every page. See for yourselves, here is the truth, and I hold it in my hands. And the conveyor belt began to operate. To understand what exactly he changed, let's simply take one soldier, an ordinary grenadier with a hole in his thigh from a Swedish bullet. Before Bidloo, his fate was sealed. He would either be left in a cart to die of infection, or the regimental barber would hack off his leg with a rusty saw, after which he would almost certainly die from surgical shock or the same gangrene. Saw, scream, grave. That was all there was to medicine. Now that same soldier arrives at Bidloo's hospital, attended by one of his students. This young man, who just yesterday feared corpses, doesn't flinch at the sight of blood. He is calm. He knows what to do. He doesn't probe the wound with dirty fingers. He takes a thin probe, which he saw in the pictures in his teacher's book, and carefully searches for the bullet. He finds it, extracts it with special forceps, cleanses the wound not with enchanted water, but with wine alcohol, applies a clean linen dressing instead of covering it with dirt, and the soldier survives. Yes, he will limp, but he will live. He will return to service. He is once again a fighting unit, not a decaying body in a mass grave. And there were dozens of such soldiers, then hundreds. The hospital beyond the Yauza ceased to be merely a place where people were brought to die. It became a place from which they emerged alive. For the first time in Russia's history, the army began to get its wounded back. This changed everything. Morale, the outcomes of battles, the very value of a soldier's life. The factory was running at full capacity. But the most important thing happened later. These first 50 students, these former priests' sons and orphans, dispersed among the regiments. And each of them carried not only Bidloo's book, but also his main lesson, doubt and see for yourself. And so, in a field camp near Narva, a young physician refuses to bleed a sick general, instead giving him quinine. And the general survives. And in a distant garrison, another student dissects an officer who died of a strange ailment and realizes that the water in the barracks is poisoned. And he saves hundreds of lives. Knowledge began to spread across the country like ripples on water. Whom would you go to? A sorcerer with cobwebs or a man who pulled your neighbor back from the brink yesterday? The choice became obvious. Bidloo gave this country not just surgery. He gave it a chance not to die from a trifle. And this chance proved more important than any cannons. And here's the most striking thing. All his enemies, and many of his friends, thought Bidloo's strength lay in his foreign knowledge, in thick books, in exotic instruments, in his knowledge of Latin. They thought he had brought some secret cure for death, but he brought nothing that couldn't be found there. Corpses were available. Knives were available. People capable of learning were also found. He brought only one thing: permission. Permission not to take things at face value. Permission to pick up a scalpel and see for oneself. And it turned out that the most potent medicine in the world is not some miraculous powder. It is simply courage. The courage to look death in the face, to understand how life is truly structured.